In the spring of 1987, a university archivist in Albuquerque, New Mexico, discovered a cardboard box in a basement storage room scheduled for demolition. Inside, beneath decades of dust and the weight of forgotten paperwork, lay 17 chess score sheets, meticulously notated games played between 1952 and 1953. The player's name, written in precise mechanical pencil at the top of each sheet, Edward Crane. No Edward Crane appears in any official Chess Federation records from that period. No photographs exist. No birth certificate has been found. And yet, according to these scoresheets and a handful of cryptic references in university documents, Edward Crane played chess in New Mexico during the height of the Cold War, and some of his games, when analyzed decades later, bear an unsettling resemblance to actual military operations that wouldn't be declassified until the 1990s. This is the story of a player who may have existed at the intersection of chess and national security, where the 64 squares of the board became a laboratory for nuclear strategy. Or it's the story of an elaborate legend, a Cold War myth that tells us more about our paranoia than our history. Perhaps it's both. To understand the Edward Crane mystery, we must first understand Los Alamos, New Mexico, in 1952. 7 years after the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the laboratory that built them was still very much operational. The scientists who'd worked on the Manhattan Project, many still haunted by what they'd created, now turned their attention to an equally terrifying question: what happens next? The Cold War was entering its most paranoid phase. The Soviet Union had detonated its own atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than American intelligence predicted. The Korean War was grinding towards stalemate. And at Los Alamos, scientists were developing not just bigger bombs, but more sophisticated ways to think about using them. This required a new kind of thinking: strategic, probabilistic, game theoretic. John von Neumann, the brilliant Hungarian mathematician, had already laid the groundwork with his theories about games and economic behavior. The Rand Corporation in California was running war game simulations, trying to model how rational actors might behave in a nuclear crisis. But chess, ancient, pure, perfectly bounded chess, offered something unique: a battlefield where every variable could be controlled, where strategy could be isolated and studied. According to fragmentary records from the University of New Mexico's research division, a man named Edward Crane was paid $175 monthly between November 1952 and March 1953, roughly $2,000 in today's money. The payment ledger describes his work only as consulting services, behavioral modeling. The funds came from an account linked to a Department of Energy precursor agency, the Atomic Energy Commission. The payments stopped abruptly in April 1953. What did Edward Crane actually do? The 17 scoresheets found in that Albuquerque basement tell a strange story. Crane played against various opponents, some identified only by initials, others by first names: Robert, James K., Dr. Mendez. The games themselves are competent but not brilliant by grandmaster standards. Crane won 12, drew 3, lost 2. But here's where the story takes its conspiratorial turn. In 1994, a retired Air Force colonel and amateur chess historian named Douglas Fairbank examined the Crane scoresheets at the University of New Mexico archives. Fairbank had spent his career studying Cold War military strategy, and something about Crane's games nagged at him. He began mapping the moves onto geopolitical scenarios. Crane's game from December 12, 1952, a victory playing the white pieces, featured an aggressive king's pawn opening followed by a systematic destruction of black's defensive structure through a series of rook and knight maneuvers. Fairbank noticed that the spatial logic of the game, the way Crane isolated and eliminated defensive positions, mirrored a classified Air Force operational plan from 1951 for neutralizing Soviet air defense networks in Eastern Europe. The plan, declassified in 1991, used nearly identical geometric principles: isolate, suppress, advance. Coincidence? Perhaps. But there were more. A game from January 1953 shows Crane sacrificing a queen, chess's most powerful piece, to achieve a devastating tactical advantage 7 moves later. Fairbank compared this to contingency plans for limited nuclear exchange, where initial losses might be acceptable if they created strategic openings. The parallel was uncomfortable. Most disturbing was a game from March 8, 1953, Crane's second-to-last recorded match. Playing black, Crane allowed his opponent to build an enormous material advantage, then executed a stunning counterattack from a position that looked hopeless. The pattern, strategic retreat, apparent weakness, sudden overwhelming force, matched operational concepts that wouldn't be publicly discussed until Henry Kissinger's writings on limited war in the 1960s. Were these games deliberate simulations? Was Crane testing strategic concepts on the chessboard before they'd be applied to actual military planning? Or are we simply projecting patterns onto random data, the way humans see faces in clouds? Fairbank published his findings in a small military history journal in 1995. The article was largely ignored, dismissed as the work of an overeager pattern seeker. One reviewer wrote, "Chess is strategy. War is strategy. Finding similarities is like being amazed that both use mathematics." But the mystery deepens when we look at who else was in New Mexico during those months. Los Alamos in the early 1950s was a company town, and the company was nuclear weapons. Scientists lived in compounds, their work classified, their movements sometimes monitored. But they were also human beings who needed recreation, intellectual stimulation beyond physics equations and bomb designs. Chess was popular among the scientists. Robert Oppenheimer, the lab's wartime director, was known to play. Stanislaw Ulam, the mathematician who helped design the hydrogen bomb, was a strong player. The lab even had an informal chess club that met Thursday evenings. We have no direct evidence that Edward Crane ever set foot in Los Alamos proper. The guest logs are incomplete, and much remains classified. But Albuquerque is only 90 miles from Los Alamos, a manageable drive, even in 1952. And the University of New Mexico had extensive contracts with the laboratory for research support and personnel services. Could Crane have been what intelligence services call a cutout, someone whose official identity was deliberately obscured to provide deniability? Could his chess games have been a form of operational testing that couldn't be conducted through normal military channels? There's a suggestive detail in the payment ledger. The university account that paid Crane was managed by a Dr. Hermann Schaefer, a physicist who'd worked on radar development during World War II and consulted for Los Alamos on electronic systems. Schaefer's own records show frequent trips to Washington, D.C., during the period Crane was being paid. He died in 1968, and his papers were largely destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1971. One surviving document, a letter from Schaefer to a colleague dated February 1953, mentions the chess problem, and notes that our consultant has demonstrated the viability of the approach, though ethical questions remain. The letter was found in a separate collection at MIT and only connected to the Crane payments in 2003, when a graduate student was researching Cold War science funding. What ethical questions? What approach? On April 14, 1953, according to a brief notation in the University of New Mexico Personnel Office, Edward Crane's consulting arrangement was terminated by mutual agreement. No forwarding address was provided. The final payment was issued on April 30th. That same month, the Atomic Energy Commission held a series of closed-door meetings about security procedures, prompted by growing concern about Soviet espionage. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, would be executed in June. The paranoia was reaching fever pitch. Did Edward Crane leave because his work was complete, or because someone decided he knew too much? The handful of researchers who pursued the Crane mystery have found no trace of him after April 1953. No death certificate. No marriage license. No passport records. No Social Security Administration records, though the SSA database is admittedly incomplete for that era. It's as if Edward Crane simply ceased to exist, or perhaps never existed in the first place. One theory, proposed by Fairbank and elaborated by a few conspiracy researchers, is that Crane was either a foreign agent or became concerned about the implications of his work and fled the country. The timing aligns with several documented defections from American research programs during the early 1950s. But there's no evidence Crane possessed classified information, and no intelligence agency has ever acknowledged his existence. Another theory is simpler and sadder. Crane was real, his work was mundane, and he simply moved on with his life, changing his name or dying in obscurity. The chess score sheets could have been kept by a friend or colleague, filed away and forgotten. The apparent parallels between his games and military strategy could be pure coincidence, amplified by the human tendency to find meaning in randomness. Or perhaps, and this is where the theory enters truly speculative territory, Edward Crane was a carefully constructed identity, a legend in intelligence parlance, created to provide cover for a research program that no one wanted to acknowledge. Game theory research. Behavioral modeling. The application of abstract strategy to real-world horror. If so, who was the person behind the name? And where did they go? Today, artificial intelligence programs have mastered chess so completely that humans can no longer compete at the highest levels. But in 1952, chess was still the domain of human intuition, pattern recognition, strategic thinking. It was a mirror we held up to our own intelligence, and perhaps, to our capacity for violence dressed as rationality. The Edward Crane mystery endures not because we have evidence of a conspiracy, but because we have an absence of evidence, an absence of a person, an absence of certainty. And into that absence, we pour our anxieties about the Cold War, about the scientists who built weapons they could barely control, about the distance between a game and reality. The score sheets still exist, preserved now in climate-controlled storage at the University of New Mexico. Researchers can request to view them with 3 days' notice. They look utterly ordinary, pencil marks on yellowing paper, the notation of moves in a game that ended 70 years ago. In chess, we speak of phantom positions, board states that never actually occurred but haunt the analysis of what did happen. Moves not made, strategies not pursued, possibilities that vanished the moment a piece was touched. Perhaps Edward Crane is a phantom position in history. A possibility that may or may not have existed, a player whose games may or may not have meant anything beyond themselves, a mystery that tells us as much about our need for conspiracy as it does about the Cold War itself. Or perhaps somewhere, in a city we haven't thought to search, in an archive we haven't thought to check, there's a photograph of a man at a chessboard, his face blurred by time and poor film quality, his name tag just barely legible, E. Crane. And perhaps he's smiling, because he knows what we can only guess. The truth about Edward Crane, if truth is even the right word, remains elusive. We have score sheets without a player, payments without documentation, theories without proof. We have a name that might be real or might be a convenience, games that might be simulations or might be recreation, a disappearance that might be sinister or might be nothing at all. What we know for certain is this: in a basement in Albuquerque, someone kept 17 chess games for 35 years. Someone thought they mattered enough to preserve. And now, decades later, we're still wondering why. Perhaps that's the real legacy of Edward Crane, not the games themselves, but our inability to stop asking questions about them. In an age of secrets and strategy, paranoia and power, the line between chess and war became dangerously thin. And at that intersection, for a brief moment in 1952 and 1953, there may have been a player who understood both games better than anyone. Or maybe there was just a man who liked chess, whose name happened to be Edward Crane, who moved on with his life and never imagined he'd become a legend. The board is empty now. The players are gone. But the mystery remains, 64 squares of uncertainty, waiting for someone to make the next move.